This is Eddie Wilson welcoming you to Austin Roots, a podcast about how Austin, Texas became flavored the way it is.
And this is Dr. Jason Mellard, a cultural historian, doing my best to connect the old and the new in this city we call home.
Or the center of the musical universe.
John Lomax III has a long and distinguished career across the music industry as writer, manager, producer, and so much more. From Austin to Houston and Nashville to the world at large, he's authored multiple books on country music and has worked with artists such as Townes Van Zandt, Steve Earle, Casey Chambers, Sonny Sweeney, and so many more. We're so lucky to have him with us here today.
Oh boy, thank you for having me. I'd also like to add David Schnaufer, who no one has probably heard of, but who basically is a Texas fellow who reinvented the dulcimer. And he found his dulcimer in Austin. He wanted to play guitar, but his hands were too small, so he became a dulcimer player. And we're presently working on a biography of him that we hope to get out sometime in the next year or two.
We have so much ground to cover in terms of your life and career, and I feel like one of the logical places to start might be to acknowledge the larger context of the fact that you're part of a folklore dynasty. At many of these pivotal moments in American cultural history, you can almost guarantee that there is a Lomax in the room with a recording device and teaching us all a lesson.
I think of that whole period of knowing about the Lomaxes as being an era that evolved as the folk music era, because it was at my youth point there, it was trying to break out about the same time that rock and roll was trying to get cranked up. One was kind of going forward, one was going backward, and Lomax, to the whole notion of anything folk was kind of like Billy Graham to the notion of Protestant Christianity, and the name Lomax was everywhere.
So I thought we might start by sketching out the family tree a little.
Well, the whole thing started in, I would say, sometime in the mid-1880s. My grandfather and his family moved from north central Mississippi to Texas in 1869, which was when there was a great migration in the post-Civil War period of people moving because of Reconstruction, and also just because there was a lot of land in Texas and not a whole lot of things going on. So they settled in Meridian, Texas, or outside Meridian, Texas, in Bosque County, which, unbeknownst to them at the time they moved there, became smack in the middle of one of the main branches of the Chisholm Trail. So grandfather would lie in bed at night and hear the cowboys nearby. They would stop often to spend the night nearby, practically in their yard. And he'd hear them singing songs, which they would do to keep the cattle calmed down. And he got fascinated with this, so sooner or later he started sneaking out of the house and hanging out with the cowboys and writing down the words to the songs that he heard. And somehow, without any musical training, without any books, the only book they had in the house was Pilgrim's Progress, and without any instruction, he figured out a way to remember the melodies of the songs that he heard that he was writing down all these words for. So years later, in 1910, after a long, arduous struggle and going around, literally in the beginning, he was carrying a tape recorder on a horseback. He had half of it hung off the saddle horn and half of it on the pommel. And this was one of those giant things that looked like his master's voice in the RCA ads of the dog singing into the giant inverted triangular looking loudspeaker, or actually microphone. So he went around starting recording cowboy songs, and his first book came out in 1910. By this time, he had already gone to college, beginning in Granbury. Well, let's see, he went to Texas first, got his degree, then he taught at A&M, and then he went back to Texas, where one of his professors told him that the songs that he was collecting, all this stuff from the cowboys, was of no value at all, and he should be listening and studying the child ballads, which was regarded as the epitome of folklore at the time. The child ballads, of course, from England. The story has it that grandfather went out and burned all his songs. However, I wonder about that, because in 1910 the book came out, Cowboy Songs and Other Frontier Ballads, made possible by the two preeminent scholars of balladry in the world who were both at Harvard, where my grandfather had gone for postgraduate work. And so they not only encouraged him, but also got him a Sheldon Fellowship and told him that this was incredibly important work and he needed to do it. So he did. He sent out originally letters to every newspaper he could contact asking about songs, and then he would go follow up. And eventually, between the start of the century and his passing in 1948, he recorded in 47 states. There were only 48 then. I'm not sure which one he missed. He traveled everywhere, recorded every kind of song. He recorded children's play party songs. He recorded in prisons. He recorded in people's yards. That was the beginning. That was actually also the first time that Home on the Range had been published in any form whatsoever. The authorship of that song has been argued for decades. He didn't claim authorship of it. He just published it in a book. And it was the first time it had been published in any sort of volume.
I was glad to hear you confirm, too, that you're suspicious that he didn't burn those songs. Whenever I teach that, I always say, like, I don't think he actually, it's just a good story.
Well, I'm sure he was mad enough to burn them, but he must have had maybe copies, and so he burned some. But how otherwise? How would he have had that book out? So,
right.
And what would he have shown Barrett Wendell and Lyman Kittredge when he went to Harvard? That's, to me, the greatest irony of the whole thing. Here is this fellow whose whole life has been tied to Texas, who actually got his start thanks to Harvard. You know, when we did the reissue of the Adventures of a Ballad Hunter and rereading that again, it was just stunning to read about him at his UT undergraduate years, essentially starting college at an advanced age and then taking enough courses for 2 years in one semester. He was taking Greek and Latin at the same time. So that was in 1910. He had a bunch of reverses. The family lived in Austin over on 26th Street. My father then went to high school at West High School, I believe it is. Grandfather had a number of problems with the university, including at one point the governor, Ferguson, was trying to basically take over the school for his own purposes, and grandfather was basically thrown out, ousted.
Yeah, he was on a short list of people named that the governor opposed, right?
Yeah, Governor Ferguson. And so the family left, moved to Chicago. It wasn't long after that before Ferguson was run out of office in disgrace for a number of different things, not to do with his university dealings, but with others. So eventually the family moved back to Austin. Well, let's see, before that he was selling bonds and stock for a brokerage firm in Chicago, and the Depression hit. That also stopped my father from being able to attend Harvard Business School. So the family had a very hard time with the Depression, and then his wife, who was the mother of my dad, Alan, Bess, and Shirley, the 4 children, died of something that I haven't fully understood, but it was some internal malady that today we would have a name for it, but at the time they didn't really. She just kind of, as they say in the South, got sick and died. So here he was financially in a shambles. His wife had died, and he hadn't been collecting songs for some time because he'd been working as a bond and stock salesman up in Chicago. So my father helped originate and plan and basically be the manager of the tour in 1933 when he and Alan, my uncle, who by this time had graduated from the University of Texas prior to being 18 years old, he went off with grandfather on their collecting trip, the famous one where they found Leadbelly. And this was the one where they had the recording machine built into the back of a Model A Ford because it weighed too much to carry. So they would literally drive as far as they could to wherever the person was they wanted to record and then record them. And by this time, they had graduated from the old horn machine to one which was actually made of, they were using metal and acetate discs. So the recording was literally live. I mean, we're talking actual live recording with the recording machine digging the grooves into the into the disc as they went. So if somebody messed up and said, "Oh gosh, I hit the wrong verse, sorry," then that whole disc was ruined and they had to start over. So they had a limited number of discs. So as a result, they would do a lot of rehearsing ahead of time to make sure that when they actually turned on the machine, then they would get a good take.
And it also meant they could play it back for the artist almost immediately, right?
Yeah.
Extremely novel experience at that time.
Oh, very much so. And some of the people they would play it for would think that they were actually talking. You know, my grandfather was doing this under the auspices of the Library of Congress. So this was all going into the collection, and some of the subjects thought they were actually going to be talking to the president, and they would go on about, "Well, Mr. President, I think you ought to." But it was extremely novel and quite extraordinary for him to record someone and then turn around and play it for them. Then another book followed as a result of all that, American Ballads and Folk Songs, and several more followed in his career, which went on until he passed away actually on the road in 1948. Ironically, 1 year before Goodnight Irene, the most famous song I guess they had recorded, became the top seller. It was the #1 record in the U.S. in 1949 for longer than any other record, even Nat King Cole. And Leadbelly passed away also in 1949. So this was kind of the best known of the 17,000 recordings that grandfather and Uncle Alan, who basically just carried on with the family tradition in field recording, eventually recorded and deposited with the Library of Congress. So by doing that, they salvaged an enormous amount of our common heritage, our culture, for future generations to listen to and enjoy and to savor and cherish and also use, which we found out in a very dramatic fashion in 2015 when a fellow named David Guetta, who is the preeminent DJ in Europe, who was also a recording artist, he got together with Nicki Minaj and they took a tiny fragment of a song called Rosie that was recorded by Uncle Alan in Parchman Farm Prison in about 1947 or 8, stuck it into another song they wrote called Hey Mama, then put another return to the Rosie theme into the middle of it, and the song became a top 10 hit in the U.S. pop charts, as well as a monster hit in 18 foreign countries. And we were, of course, delighted to see that and to see evidence of the value, the commercial value of recordings made by the family in these, and that was made in a prison. I believe a year or two later, Beyonce used a couple of fragments of Lomax field recordings in her record called Lemonade. So that's kind of it in a nutshell, other than Alan has, of course, had an amazing career that went on into around 2000. He had some strokes, and he worked all the way up till he was almost 90 before having some health problems that sidelined him, and eventually he passed.
He was interested in the digital world by the end of it and that possibility. And so now there's even, there's a website that's kind of his legacy, that cultural equity site.
And the Global Jukebox, which is his attempt to try to trace the melodic development of the world's music, which is staggering in its scope, to try to listen to a melody you might hear on the radio here and trace it back through history all over the world and see where that originally came from, that little melodic fragment that became the part of a hit song, for instance. The whole idea was to be able to trace the musical development of the entire world. And when he had the idea, they didn't have the computing capacity to even attempt to do this thing. But yes, his work lives on through the Association of Cultural Equity website and all these recordings, which you can access for free. So that's kind of it. Bess, the youngest in the family.
Bess Lomax Hawes.
Bess was the youngest of the 4 children of John Avery, and she went to Washington, and Alan got her a job, not sure what department at that time, but probably with the Library of Congress or something like that. But the family had told me that she went to Washington, then she went back to California when she married. When she was in California, she learned to teach guitar to whole classes of people, 20, 30 people at once, walking up and down the aisles and correcting people. But Ry Cooder was one of her early students. She and a friend, while they were in Boston, co-wrote the song MTA, which about an election. The song was based on reality and what was going on in Boston at the time, an election. And so it then became this monster hit for the Kingston Trio. And she I don't think, had any other songs that she ever wrote or pursued that sort of side of her. She and her husband, Butch Hawes, Hawes, had been in the Almanac Singers for a while. I don't know if they were founders or just members. I think the Almanacs were a fairly loosely knit group. I guess she then went off to Washington, took a job with the government running the folk arts division of the National Endowment of the Arts, and was in charge of the budgets for various folk projects, and was kind of considered the most beloved woman in folk music, not only for her personality, warmth, and friendliness, but also because she had the purse strings for so many projects that she could green light. And it wasn't just music, it was all manner of folk crafts and other expressions of culture. And during that period, in addition to, she helped start the American Festival of Folklife, I believe in 1967, which is enduring and goes on. And then she, right before she passed away, she wrote her own autobiography, Sing It Pretty, came out about a year before she passed away. This has been 3 or 4 years now. Then this is her Bessie Jones book, Step It Down. She had 3 children, one of whom, Nicholas Hawes, was the state folklorist for the state of Maine for many, many years. And another daughter was a primatologist who studied gorillas and apes and such in Nepal, lived up in the mountains for over a year, and then married a man named John Bishop, who is a filmmaker who worked with Alan on a lot of his films. Her other daughter, Corey, did not get involved in creative endeavors. I think she was a teacher. I'm not totally sure. They were always living in California. Unfortunately, Nicholas Hawes passed away unexpectedly during the Portland heat wave when the temperature got to 116 degrees.
And, reading about the Almanac Singers, they kind of feel like a proto-hippie commune sometimes. They had like a band house, right? And like you said, they were kind of a loose conglomeration. I think of them as like kind of the rough around the edges predecessor to the Weavers, right? Like they weren't quite as public-facing. They were a little bit more activist.
Not as polished.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the genesis of it all. Then my father became a folk singer as a hobby. He was by profession a land developer in Houston, but he started the Houston Folklore Society with several other folks in 1951, I believe it was, 51, 52. The organization endures to this day. It's no longer the Houston Folklore Society. It's called the Houston Folklore and Music Society, and they still continue. He made a few records for Smithsonian for Folkways and would perform, and his performances consisted of him walking out on stage and singing the songs a cappella that he had learned from his father, who had learned them from the Cowboys. Never played a guitar, never was interested in even learning, because he basically said the Cowboys weren't riding around on horses playing guitars. They were singing these songs this way, and so that was the way he sang them. He, in his own right, then preserved a whole bunch of songs that might otherwise have been lost or ignored. There are some of the greatest classics in Western music were songs that he had sung that his father had found. And he was on the first or second Kerrville Folk Festival. And he would just do this as a hobby, as well as he managed blues singer Lightning Hopkins for about 10 years. Lightning had no telephone. He lived over in the 3rd Ward, I guess you'd call it, in Houston. When someone would call and want Lightning to perform somewhere, my dad would have to go drive over there and find him, rarely at home, but more often hanging out in various gambling dens and whiskey drinking gatherings. And my dad would just stroll around asking around till he could find him, get the offer, and then quite often he would tour with Lightning and go as the opening act and the roadie and the manager who would collect the money and bring the money and Lightning back home safely and deposit as much of the money into the hands of Lightning's common-law wife as possible. Otherwise, Lightning would be inclined to drink it and gamble the money away. That went on for about 10 years, I guess. They made one famous trip to California and played UCLA, but also at the Ash Grove, which was one of the very, very famous folk clubs of time, and it was Lightning's first plane ride.
So John Jr., the way the family always kind of works in a sort of a synergy, I often think about John Lomax Jr. convincing John Sr. to go on that trip in 33, right? Being kind of the person to get him back into folk music. And then if that hadn't happened, that whole next chapter of all these thousands of field recordings and also launching Alan's career, like it all kind of fits together in this interesting way. And I am a Texas music historian, so people with Texas roots I tend to amplify when I can. But I think that a significant portion of the British invasion can be traced back to those field recordings, plus the fact that Alan had to leave the country during McCarthyism and had a BBC show where he was playing lead belly and folk music that all these young Brits getting into skiffle and American folk did. The first sort of British song to break into the American charts was Lonnie Donegan doing Rock Island Line, which he would have heard through.
Yeah, and claiming that he wrote it too.
Right.
It's my theory that had Alan not spent basically the entire decade of the 50s in England, there would have been no English invasion whatsoever. He not only had a BBC show, he published books, he made recordings, he promoted artists, he brought over Howlin' Wolf, he brought over Muddy Waters, whom he was the first man to record in 1939, and toured them in England, which, of course, the Rolling Stones took their name from the Muddy Waters song. And I have traced Alan's contact with the Rolling Stones far enough back to where he had recorded with Alexis Corner, who was a major influence on the early Rolling Stones development. He recorded on an album Alan made for EMI in England during that period under a pseudonym because Alexis had a record deal with someone else, so he recorded under the name of Petey Wheatstraw. So I'm pretty convinced that there wouldn't have been a Rolling Stones as we know them today had it not been for Alan. So, Alan, he wrote articles in magazines over there during that period. He had to leave, he felt, because the McCarthy people in that whole crazy Red Scare business and caused Alan to basically pack up and go to England for 10 years. And that was where he found Lonnie Donegan claiming he had written all the songs that Leadbelly was that they had recorded on Leadbelly, including Goodnight Irene, Rock Island Line, and a number of other ones. That was why in the 50s, Alan started ferreting out the sources of these songs and getting them copywritten under the name of the actual artist, Leadbelly, then, and it's been collecting on. And he and his family have been collecting on Goodnight Irene all these years. Alan also was the one who got Leadbelly into BMI early on, so he was getting paid for his broadcast use as well. Alan's motto all this time has been giving a voice to the voiceless. And he felt that the people that wrote the songs, or at least the people that sang the ones he recorded, I don't think anyone thinks Leadbelly actually wrote Goodnight Irene. It was a folk song that he began singing back whenever. But he deserved the credit for it and deserved to be paid for it. And so Alan was able to get that accomplished. That was not, of course, the only example of that. The The best known one was the James Carter episode with
Well, brother, where are you?
yeah. Song starts with a recording of a prison song by this fellow James Carter singing. Through Alan's work and his notes, a reporter with the St. Petersburg Times was able to actually track down James Carter, who's still alive 30 or 40 years later, and tell him, hey, this is in this movie. And it wound up that James Carter was given writer and performer credit for that song that starts the movie. At first, he denied he had anything to do with it because he was then married to a preacher and didn't want her to know of his prison background. But then they informed him there was a few $1 million coming to him, and his memory changed quickly at that point. But he was able to not only get the money, he's flown out to Hollywood for the Grammys, and that record actually won Album of the Year, beating out U2 and Bob Dylan and all manner of people. And there was James Carter in the audience, which is a wonderful story, but it wouldn't have been possible without Alan's meticulous notes that detailed all of the circumstances of the recording in the prison.
I probably got a little bit more attuned to the lead belly part of all that than a lot of my peers, because a lot of my peers were they were dancing age, and I was kind of a clumsy dancer and raised by Baptists, so I got to use the excuse that it was against my religion to dance, but parking in a car and necking furiously was not, somehow frowned upon so long as you didn't get pregnant.
Tell us a little bit about John Henry Faulk and how he fits into all of this.
Well, John Henry was he was a superstar on radio in the generation before my awareness of all that sort of thing. He got fired at CBS while being like the number one radio talent in the country because of the McCarthy period. And of course, anybody that had any kind of curiosity had checked out what communist clubs were all about.
Well, the Communist Party was a legitimate political party for many years in the 30s and 40s, and a lot of people went to a meeting or something simply out of curiosity and then were tarred and feathered practically for having the temerity to actually attend something due to the fact that McCarthy blew up this false communist scare in order for political gain and personal gain. And John Henry got caught in, he was the top, like Eddie said, he was the top radio guy in New York, so that meant it was the top one in the world and would probably have gone straight into television and been a major early TV figure. So when he was blacklisted, Alan, my uncle, was his roommate, and Alan could see that he figured he'd be next, so he hopped a boat and went to England for 9 years until it sort of died down, and of course McCarthy was dealt with finally.
Yeah, it caught a lot of that generation of artists and intellectuals in its snares because, like you said, the communists were quite active in the 1930s, and especially if you were a Southerner who was engaged in civil rights or labor work, which most of these people were, you came into contact and were working with communists whether you knew it or not.
Sure.
So most of these folks weren't card carrying, but if you're doing civil rights or labor work in the 1930s, it's inevitable.
Well, and the evidence presented in John Henry's case, for instance, he sued. He got Louis Nasser defended him. They wound up winning the case. It came out actually in a movie called Fear on Trial. He won the case and was awarded $1 million, which of course he never collected because the group that he had sued, which had blacklisted him, had of course gone bankrupt by then and had no money. So
didn't his adversary choke to death on a martini olive about the same day that the award came down?
Well, I don't know, but he never got any money,
yeah,
and his career never recovered.
Well, I think of John Henry being put on hee-haw as being a co-conspirator in the advance of cleavage.
He was so interesting to watch, because he could speak so eloquently and persuasively. He was such a great spokesman for liberal causes or humanitarian causes. causes, in that he could charm conservatives and the enemies and have them eating out of his hand.
Yeah.
Now, I don't think you could do that. People are so polarized. John Henry just had that. Golly, he had so much old world Southern kind of mixture of charm and intellect, and also obvious love for fellow man that poured out of him. So he was able to really insinuate his views into a lot of forums and a lot of places where someone who was probably more strident would not have been able to.
And then John Henry, too, he shows up in Texas Chainsaw Massacre. That case, his libel case, that was one of the largest awards to that date in history. Even if it wasn't paid out, it's still studied as a civil liberties case. So growing up in the mix of all of this, did it just seem normal to you? Did you at some point realize the role that your family members played in some of these musical worlds? Was there always music around?
What happened was, during my years at the university, which started in September of 62, somewhere about junior year, 65, 66, it dawned on me that I was spending all my time that I wasn't in class and wasn't hanging out drinking beer with the frat boys, going to music, going to hear shows, hanging out with musicians, buying records, listening to the records. That was back in the day when you would buy an album and sit down and listen intently to every single note on both sides and read the liner notes. So I thought, well, I ought to figure out some way to do this and get paid for it or do something. Figure out a way to keep doing that, because I wasn't very interested in history as a profession. So I started writing about music first for the Daily Texan, just 66 maybe, and doing a few concert reviews here and there. But I didn't really pursue it. My dad got me a liner note job writing about a Blind Willie Johnson record, but it was always sort of in the background. And then after I moved to Houston, I graduated, tried to go to grad school, didn't like it, dropped out, got drafted, convinced the Army I wasn't going to be a good soldier, so I got a deferment. Went to Houston, back home, and started writing about music for Space City News, which was an early underground, what we would call today alternative magazine, but then it was called Underground Press.
Yeah, we had an episode with Thorne Dreyer not too long ago.
Oh, yes, Thorne was one of the people there at the Space City News, and of course, the RAG had already started in Austin. I never wrote anything for them because I think it started right about the time I went to Houston. But I did start writing for Space City News and became quickly the music editor, which was an unpaid position, but you were able to leverage that into getting free records and free admittance to various shows. So I would go to visit these record label promo people who would essentially just give me as many records as I could haul off because they didn't want them and they needed room for the next round of records coming out. I would review records and write features and do things for Space City News, which was a weekly, and I did that for a couple of years. The magazine collapsed. I started writing for another one called Abraxas. It collapsed. Then I started writing for another one called Mockingbird. It lasted even less time. And then in June of 73, I moved up here and I kept writing a little for the Pacifica magazine called The Southern Voice at one point, and then it morphed into a different name, but it was a monthly, and I wrote a few things for them after I had moved up to Nashville in June of 73, which I had already gone and sort of looked around New York, and I sort of looked around LA. I didn't like either place. I knew I wanted to be in the music business doing something. Those cities were not to my liking.
So you're a person who has a great perspective to sort of compare and contrast across these scenes a little of Austin and Houston and Nashville and this sort of 60s to 70s art. Let's go back to Austin in your university years first, saying that you were going out and you were hearing a lot of music. What were some of the places you would have been going to hear music in the 60s in Austin? Who were some of the singers and musicians who were around?
Well, the main thing, there's two actual channels. One was I heard Townes Van Zandt the first time at a place called the 11th Door, which was 11th and Rio Grande, run by a fellow named Bill Simonson. Fabulous little folk club with an upstairs bar, and then if you wanted to pay the cover, you'd go downstairs where they had the music. So a fellow named Caddo Perry Studdard III dragged me over there to hear Townes one night in 66, something like that. I stayed in touch with Townes from that point forward. And so that was one. And then the main thing that was going on then, at least to my mind, was the whole birth of psychedelia and the 13th Floor Elevators and other bands that were somewhat similar, but nothing approaching the Elevators, who to this day have a sound that no one has replicated or even come close to. Over and above having Rocky Erickson singing in a voice that someone described as something that could stop a wolf in its tracks, you had Tommy Hall playing an electrified jug, which I've never heard anyone else do. It was a big old jug he'd hold up against the mic and make these noises into it that would reverberate out and give them a rhythmic element that no one else had. And it was this really bizarre sounding thing buried in the mix, sort of, but it was in there. It was sort of like what people use banjos for today, just to have them in there so they can say they have a banjo. But this was a prominent feature, and it was something like, and that would go into this jug, which was really looked like an old whiskey jug, and it would come back out with this incredible, interesting sound. And so they had that going on, and they were the first band I can remember that would do almost entire shows of original material. They were the first band I remember that would play literally at volume level of 11. I mean, they would literally have to have roadies holding the top of the speaker cabinets to keep it from vibrating off the top. They were playing so loud, and they were playing in small rooms. I remember seeing them in the Jade room, also on Rio Grande, and of course at the Vulcan gas company, which became the headquarters for psychedelic music and also home to Conqueroo and Shiva's Head Band. Those were two of the other top local bands. And the Elevators, though, were the ones to me that actually started the whole idea of a band being able to go out and play a set of their own material. Before that, it was everyone covering. A lot of covers of early English stuff, Dylan, soul things, Wilson Pickett, James Brown, and stuff like that. But the Elevators would do entire sets, and they might have one cover. It's All Over Now, Baby Blue was one they did. But they had very few covers, and they got away with it. They did it. And from that point on, other bands saw that there was an opportunity for them to play original music. But until that came along, I don't remember seeing a band that would do the originals. And that's sort of been obscured. The Elevators are sort of written off as a garage band who happened to stumble onto psychedelia when they actually created the form itself, created the word for it, and were really should be more remembered for the fact that they showed everyone you didn't have to make a whole set out of covers.
Yeah, you mentioned this was sort of through two channels, and the electric jug might be the link here that answers my question, but was it, in your experience, sort of natural for the same people to be interested in the folk music and in that psychedelic rock? It seems like there's a transition there that happens. So do you have the same people who went to Threadgills, would they be showing up a little bit later at Vulcan, for example?
I don't know, because I never got out to Threadgills in the original incarnation before when it got to be famous. Somehow I just missed that altogether. And I don't really know. Townes and Rocky were buddies and would hang out some. There wasn't, there were only maybe 6 or 7 places to hear live music back in that time frame. This was way before Soap Creek ever came along, I think. After I got my master's in library science, I went off to New York for a year and then came back and worked at the Houston Public Library. And I guess that was when you were still, I think, working as a beer distributor maybe then.
I was working for the U.S. Brewers Association, representing every brand.
Was there much overlap between the sort of musical work you were doing and the sort of musical work your father was doing in those years in Houston? So, I mean, would you have intersected through people like Lightning Hopkins? Were you around him at all?
There wasn't really much overlap. He had his thing where he would go out and sing, and I was at the time still in college most of that period, and when he was managing Lightning, I did get Lightning at some point. He was in Austin for something, and I heard about it, and I went and found him and dragged him over to apartment project where a bunch of my cronies were, and paid him $100 to do a show for us, which he did. And I'm sure a lot of the people didn't have a clue, but there was Lightning Hopkins over there. But I was basically trying to create a career for myself in doing this. My dad was doing his thing, so we really didn't cross paths that much in terms of the musical thing. I was sitting there writing about all manner of stuff, and the music part for him was never an occupation. It was his avocation. He was developing homes in Houston during a period when it was just bursting out, growing. I mean, he and a famous football player named Chris Gilbert's dad, Earle Gilbert, got together, and they would buy big chunks of land and build federal housing and GI loan houses on them, and then rent the houses out for 3, 4, 5 years, write off a whole lot of depreciation, and then turn around and sell the house, which would have appreciated considerably during the time they've had the house and renting it. They had several other subdivisions, but out on the north side, out near what's now in the airport area, that was where they built the most homes. So he was doing that, and any side time he had, he was involved with Lightning, and also going around singing mostly to civic groups, community gatherings, libraries. And he would generally sing and talk about the history of these songs and his father and all of that. So we didn't really connect all that much in terms of my career and his.
I was just going to ask about the relationship between Houston and Austin at this time. You know, you're going back to Houston. Your father is involved very much so in that folk scene, but there's also a psychedelic scene in Houston. So once you got into Houston, once you were working with Space City News, what was that cultural landscape like?
Liberty Hall was a wonderful joint.
Mike Condrey came into my existence on a Sheila's trip to Houston when he was still running a co-op that fed a lot of people every day at lunch. It was a little cafe, a little restaurant. I can't remember the name of it.
Texas Moon Cafe.
Condrey was in charge of that before I had the Armadillo, but he always served as a bit of a role model, because the first 2 or 3 times I met with him, he was in the middle of mopping the floor. And so I knew that I wasn't going to ever probably try to outwork him, but it was a good example of how hand to mouth that sort of effort was always deemed to be. If you had a joint to run, you obviously had more than 7 days a week you needed to be there. And Condrey just worked his ass off.
Roberto joined at some point, and they were the 2 principals that I remember.
Roberto came in there and saved Condrey from working himself to death.
Yeah, Liberty Halls, their hardest problem really was that you could only get around 400 in there. So they would do 2 shows a night on Friday and Saturday, and usually 1 on Thursday and Sunday. So that would be 6 appearances, but still with only a max capacity of 2,400. It was tough to bring in acts that would fit that demographic who didn't want to go and just play the music hall with 2,000 and do 1 show or something, or another venue where they wouldn't have to play multiple times. So, but they got a bunch of great artists in there. Golly.
Armadillo would get them either the week before or the week after for a couple of nights.
There wasn't a bad seat in the house, so to speak. They had a balcony and all manner of weird stuff, I'm sure, would go on back there because it was in the dark in the back of the room. The front row was 6 feet from the stage, and the stage was maybe only 3 feet off the ground. So it was a lovely spot. And this was back in the days when no one cared if you wandered around taking pictures of the bands or the people or anything. There wasn't any worries about rights or this or that. The green room was as wide as the building, and it was up above the stage, and it was serviced from the bar underneath through a rope and a bucket that you would lower down from the green room. They would fill up the bucket with beer, and you would bring it back upstairs that way. That and the old quarter were the main places that I went, other than I was able to worm my way into a lot of the music hall and Coliseum huge shows using my credentials as the music editor of the weekly underground paper, and a lot of chutzpah, essentially, acting like I was with the Houston Chronicle or something. I wonder now why I wasn't actually just booted. I was able to get away with it for a number of years.
Bill Simonson, Dallas habitue, after taking it on the chin in Austin, he had Mother Blues. They had a lot of acts that typically wouldn't have gotten into a place that size if it hadn't have been for Simonson having been through a lot of wars already and being pretty tough. And everybody knew who he was, so they knew it'd probably come off.
He tried to do a Vulcan gas company kind of thing around over on 6th Street, I think, in an old movie theater. This would have been in 66 or 7, and it didn't take. The Vulcan wasn't good enough for the amount of crowd that kind of act could pull in.
Yeah.
That went nowhere, unfortunately.
He was managing 3 joints, the Fred, 11th door, and it seemed like another one. He had the elevators in and actually dosed a whole lot of the audience with acid. Got everybody right out on the edge of their ability to deal with the reality of just sitting in a chair, and all of a sudden ran them all out on a bomb scare, and then opened the doors back up and charged everybody that came back in. He didn't have very many successes that exceeded that one. And there was a huge, huge deluge. A couple of them flooded real bad, and a band's equipment got up to the handles in the basement water. And shortly after that, Simonson said when he heard the knock on the door and refused to get out of bed, and heard the footsteps of hard-soled detective shoes on his hardwood floor that came up to his covers and said, "Are you Bill Simonson? You need to come with me." And he went away for a year to prison.
God, ooh, I didn't realize.
Bill was a hard luck case. He was a hard luck case. He jumped on Bill Campbell's back one time as they walked out of Mother Bruce, just having a good time and joking and being, silly, high as a kite. And he, the little skinny guy jumped up on Bill Campbell's back, reached up and grabbed him by the hair and then threw him over his shoulder and broke his back on the ramp leading out of Mother Blues. That's when Campbell was playing with Kenneth Threadgill, if you can imagine such a combination.
God.
The Ritz on 6th Street had a lot of people throw themselves face first on it trying to make it work. But it was pretty short-lived in most all of their efforts. Jim Franklin even.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Jim Franklin, until he finally gave up.
That was like 74, 75?
It was when he had moved out of the Armadillo to compete with the Armadillo, but he still lived at the Armadillo while he competed with us.
And then Mac Royal has really good photographs of that run of the Ritz. It was a pretty short run, but he did some great photo documentation.
He shot a lot of stuff there. Willie played that first thing with Doug Psalm, using Hank's electric guitar. We got him on tape, and Willie was as amazed at Doug's energy as Willie was amazed at Jerry Jeff Walker's breath. We have a good picture of Willie and Jerry Jeff at the same microphone. You can tell when Willie gets a whiff of Jerry Jeff's breath, his eyes get big and he backs up from the microphone.
And then I think some of Rocky Erickson's big comeback shows where it would have been the next iteration of the Ritz, I think. Like the Ritz was kind of like a punk new wave club right after Jim's club. John, you're in an interesting position because you were part of this sort of Texans in Nashville crowd.
I left right about the time that you were getting the Armadillo going. I came up to Nashville with Rocky Hill, who was coming up here to do some recording with Johnny Winter. And for whatever reason, they were doing it in Nashville, and Rocky wanted somebody to ride up with him. He wouldn't fly. He wouldn't have to drive up by himself with his girlfriend because they fought a lot. And he figured if he had somebody else in the car, then they wouldn't have huge fights. But that was how I came to Nashville. And when I did, I just realized that it was really the sort of place I wanted to be in. It was quiet. It was almost like a little university. All of the music business practically was confined to a small area, much like a college campus. You could meet people and get around and do things, and it was a lot calmer sort of environment. People don't dance. So when I got here from Texas, people playing, everyone sitting in their chairs or at the tables, politely clapping or maybe jumping up and down screaming, but hardly anyone ever danced. And coming out of Texas, I just found that very odd. I've never been a huge dancer, but I thought it was part of the whole system was you would have people dancing. If it was country music, then you were supposed to be dancing, weren't you? And they weren't. They were all looking to see what person in the industry was doing so they wouldn't step out of line. The major labels were starting to really take over the scene, and everyone was wanting to make sure they could get an appointment with them when they had something to sell. I had a connection to Jack Clement, so I went to work for Cowboy Jack Clement as a sort of a publicist at first. He had a publicity company and eventually wound up working as his publicist for a little while and then worked for his record label, JMI, was famous for finding and starting the solo career of Don Williams. And of course, Jack is now in the Country Music Hall of Fame, a writer, producer, publisher, and general stimulant for hundreds of people that came through Nashville. Jack got his start, really. Well, he didn't really get his start, but he really got launched at Sun. He had started when he was playing bluegrass on the East Coast, still in the Marines, and played a little bit there. But when he came back to Memphis, he got involved with Sam Phillips and was engineering for Sam, and was actually the person that really discovered Jerry Lee Lewis. Sam wasn't even in Memphis at the time. He was off at a convention in Nashville, and Jack was sitting in the office one day, and the secretary said, "There's a wacky guy here, wants you to hear him." And Jack said, "Well, what's the deal?" And the woman said, "Well," he said that he plays piano like Chet Atkins plays guitar. And Jack sort of said, "Oh, well, okay, bring him back." And he was. And so Jack recorded Jerry Lee and left the tape for Sam to find when he came back from Nashville, where he was at the DJ convention. So it was really Cowboy and not Sam Phillips that found Jerry Lee. He had worked with Roy Orbison there at Sun, but they never really got anything much going. The biggest record that came out of that was called Ooby Dooby, which kind of charted, but didn't really make much impact. And Jack's comment really was that Roy Orbison wanted to do things that the studios weren't capable of actually doing back then. It wasn't until later when they got multiple tracks and he got to Nashville and went to work with Fred Foster that he made all those classic records. Because they had even tried him at RCA, Chet had, and tried to make Roy Orbison into a basic hillbilly singer. That one didn't work. It wasn't until Fred Foster and Monument Records when he made all the great records that we know of today.
Both of you would have good perspectives on this, which is the relationship between Austin and Nashville in the 1970s. You know, the perception that they were opposed to one another, but also these realities that they're quite connected to one another musically and culturally at that time. You know, what are your thoughts or your perceptions on that sense that Austin and Nashville were rivals in the 70s?
I don't know that you could say they were rivals so much as Nashville was sort of jealous of Austin's live music and all of the opportunities there, whereas Austin considered Nashville evil people because this was where all the business was, and this was where BMI was, and ASCAP, and all of the record companies, and all of the booking agencies, a whole lot of the studios, and a whole lot of the players. So it was, I guess, the commercial side, whereas Austin was the R&D side.
Austin has always had an attitude.
Yeah.
I've always said that "Nye, nye, 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 nye" was Austin's theme song. It looked down on everybody for looking down on it. It was always hard for me to get into that discussion because there can be no winner.
From the way I see it as an historian looking back, I'm really more struck by what's shared between the two places as much as what's different. You know, John, you're right that one seemed to be the business center and one seemed to be like where something creative was happening. But, if we just think about the people in that circle of, Guy and Townes and Susanna and yourself and Steve Earle and, a bunch of these Texans who were in Nashville, because that's kind of where the business and songwriting was, but they were making the same kind of work that Austin was saying that it was proud of, right?
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of shared ground. Of course, they were all Texans gone to Nashville.
Steve Earle came, Townes and Guy. Richard Dobson came. In addition to them, Rodney Crowell came up to Nashville. All of those songwriters went on to greater glory, and all were kind of from the same basic Houston folklore sort of scene where they grew up listening to folk music and playing it, and then coming to Nashville and trying to insert themselves into the scene, and with varying results, but they're all now revered as terrific songwriters, Richard Dobson being probably the least well-known of them all, but might be actually is the equivalent of any of in terms of his the songs that he's written and the things that he's done, and he seemed to be snake bit. He had a Johnny Cash cut sit in the unreleased for over 30 years, and then of course Old Friends, which he wrote with Guy and Susanna, has been recorded by a number of different people. All five of them came out of the same environment and during the same small window of time, and probably about a year and a half they all moved to Nashville, and they didn't lose their Texanness. They learned to kind of speak the language here enough to get along. Guy realized, I think early on, he didn't really want to pursue the superstar, out on the road constantly with a bus and 80 people depending on you. He just wanted to write songs and sing them. And he was able to figure out, okay, Nashville's good for a nice, steady publishing draw. Once you have a few hits, then you can have a guaranteed income of some kind from a publisher and a place to go write songs, so you don't have to sit around the house all day long. So he was able to use the system and figure out how to make it work for him. And some of the Austin people just didn't want to take the time or the trouble. Plus, Austin in Texas has their own scene down there where you really can function quite well and make a very good living and never play outside the state of Texas unless you go up to Tulsa or Oklahoma somewhere and play there for a couple of shows.
Well, it was, how many can you pack into a car or a station wagon or the little U-Haul behind it? The Shiva's Headband period, which for me was my virgin voyage, was right straight into a scene that wanted to call itself counterculture, and to them it meant non-commercial. And I found out very soon that non-commercial means, oh shit, we can't sell this stuff. You have to try really hard to sell stuff, and they were determined to try real hard not to be accused of trying to sell stuff. What it really boiled down to is a great cover for not having much of a work ethic. That just killed it. Hank was asked to come back to Austin from his trip to Canada and play guitar with Shiva's Headband. He hadn't been back 2 days and couldn't get a rehearsal schedule, out of Spencer, because that was just the last thing on Spencer's mind. And Hank was desperately trying to learn the songs and get into the groove, and it was just kind of like not having a groove.
So both of you kind of came into the industry side of things, partially through friends or peers who, asked you to be managers. I don't know if they approached you, but, thinking about the parallels between Eddie, you, and Spencer and Shiva's, and John and Townes, do you think it was something about that era that had artists seeking out people who they felt were like them to be part of their team?
Spencer came over to my house, knocked on the door, introduced himself as being close to my main mentor, Stan Alexander, in the English department. Within an hour, got me high on LSD, realized that I had a suit, and so he didn't have to get a suit. He never would have to get a suit. He found the suit. He wanted me to represent them in the places that you'd have to wear a suit. I never wore a suit again. He felt good because I had one. And, of course, I went with Spencer to the bank to open up an account with both of our names on it. And, Spencer looked, like something out of a horror show to these people with that big beard and those Coke bottle glasses. I was a proud junior lobbyist trainee from the Brewers Association that all of a sudden I'm there with a couple of $10,000, $15,000 checks from Capitol Records to open accounts for Armadillo Productions and Shiva's Headband. And they were aghast. I went back home after opening the accounts. She was going to leave town for California and record the next day. So I was going to be left in charge. Had to get my name on a signature. Went home. The mail was there. We turned right around and went right straight back to the bank and walked in with a $15,000 check, a $10,000 check, and you'd have thought we had guns drawn. Those people couldn't believe that when we were in there just an hour before that we were legitimate business people. But, I had my cred. I needed a haircut before the end of that week.
I've got the album still.
Yeah.
Great cover, too. Fabulous.
Well, Jim Franklin could whip out a cover all right. But they went out there to record with Fred Cotero, who was a fine, well-known producer, and they had a guitarist that had never played with the band before, didn't know the songs, a 17-year-old who was a great connection for LSD in San Antonio, but had absolutely no skills whatsoever developed yet to the point of the band had been signed with a completely different cast of characters than what showed up at the studio. Fred Cotero tried to talk him into saving the money, go home and learn this material. Don't waste your money here in the studio. But they learned the songs while the tapes were rolling. And the album was just such a disappointment compared to what that band was capable of. I've been trying to get over the disappointment, all of it, for 40 years now.
Boy. Well, with Townes, I kind of sought him out because Guy and Susanna and I realized that it would be good for him to move to Nashville because he was up there in Colorado and his label had collapsed, but that didn't really matter because Townes had fallen off his guitar and broken his arm, and his guitar later was stolen. So he was living in a tent in Colorado, and we thought it might be better circumstances here. And so when he moved here, I just decided I would be a manager and jumped up and became one. Put an ad in Rolling Stone, 3-line ad in the classifieds saying, join the Townes Van Zandt fan club, world's greatest songwriter. And figured I'd get 5 or 10 responses, and instead I got over 100. I had been working for Jack Clement, and I was used to seeing country fan letters, which in most cases were a step above Crayolas on Big Chief tablet paper, but not much. It was people writing in, like your music, send me a picture, and there would be 2 or 3 misspelled words. But Townes' letters we got from people responding to the Rolling Stone ad were just staggeringly well-written and emotionally draining letters of people talking about how his music had saved their lives and listening to him had kept them from killing themselves and all of these things like this. But they were so eloquent and they were almost all handwritten, multiple pages. And so I was a manager. That was the start of it all. And I think at some point some artists just need a manager that has enthusiasm, excitement, loves the music, and will just go 24/7 for them. Whether they actually know what they're doing is sort of not not as important at that stage as just having somebody there to crank you, get your career jump started again, and somebody there working for him instead of being out there doing everything by himself. And so once he got here, I got him a booking agent, and guy I think loaned him a guitar, and next thing you know, he got going, and pretty soon Emmy Lou cut Poncho and Lefty, and off we went. And the Old Quarter album came out finally, the one that had been sat in the can 4 years, and reissued 5 of the first 6 albums. So all of a sudden, within a 2-year period, he had 5 albums reissued, 1 new studio album, and finally, at long last, the live album that all his fans knew was sitting there in the can, but finally got out there. I was supplanted within a couple of years by the forces of darkness, who had their best interest in mind, not Townes's. And
such a monumental and challenging task from what most of us know of his biography. And Townes Van Zandt has become such a legendary and an iconic figure, especially since his passing.
Well, there have been more records released posthumously than were released during his life. Yeah, he died on January 1st, the same day as Hank Williams. Very spooky, because he had told people that he was going to die same age as Hank Williams, and he did. And it was also the same age his father died. His father fell over dead from a heart attack. He came from a very prominent Fort Worth family. One of his relatives is the source of the name of Townes Hall in UT. Decided he wanted to be a troubadour, and the family was hoping he'd be a lawyer, a famous lawyer like his father. That wasn't the way it worked out.
And as much as he's become sort of this abstract figure of a doomed poet in some ways, is there anything that you would like people to know about him as a flesh and blood man? Something about Townes as a person that you knew?
Well, his sense of humor really kind of gets overshadowed by the tragedy. And if you saw the movie Be Here to Love Me, there's a scene in there where he's being interviewed. The source of the interview was from that concert in Amsterdam. And they ask him, what does it take to be a songwriter? He says, well, first of all, you just have to throw away everything except that. Throw away everyone you know. Throw away all your relationships. Throw away everything and just do this and do nothing but that. And it was just like, yeah, well, maybe I'll find another career. Thank you. He had a sense of humor, and people forget that, even though on some of the albums he has some of his really bad jokes that he would tell on stage. He was a major gambler. He was the one that taught me to play liar's poker. If you didn't have any money, you had to have dollar bills to play liar's poker. But if you didn't have any money, if you had a penny or a nickel or something, then you could pitch it against a wall and gamble on that to see who could get the penny to hang, get closest to the wall. But he had a really funny sense of humor. I don't know how that held up over the years, because when I worked with him, he did drink a lot and he smoked pot, but so did everyone then, at least in the circles we were running in. But he didn't have the horrible drug problems at that point. So during the time I worked with him, he never really had any issues that caused him to miss a show, for instance. And it wasn't until later that substance abuse problems really started to kick in. That, and, he didn't eat right, didn't exercise, and all of the other things you're supposed to do if you want to stay alive. I swore I'd never manage again. And that lasted 6 years. 5 years till Steve Earle. I didn't get cured of the habit until 2007.
Sonny Sweeney and Casey Chambers.
Yeah, that was the last 2. They finished me off. Sonny did, actually. Casey, I had 4 years and then got booted so her brother could mismanage her career. And with Sonny, it was just, she wanted her husband to manage her, and so he did. And I found out about it secondhand. And that was it. No more artists. And I've held firm. I regret some of it, some things I should have done that I didn't, but helped move their careers along. And I think I can say that I left them in better shape than I found them.
Yeah, it's definitely a catalyst moment for, like you said, Townes's Live at the Old Quarter finally comes to fruition and comes out around the time that you're taking over management.
Live at the Old Quarter was recorded, I believe, in 1973, before I moved to Nashville. A fellow named Earle Willis, who lived in Houston. He was a chemical engineer, but a real music junkie, I guess you could call him. He hung out with musicians and was a friend of Jack Cowboy Clement. He befriended Townes early on, and they cooked up the plan to record this live album. And the fellow at the record label said he would, he'd pay for it and all that. So they went to the Old Quarter, and they actually recorded on 4 nights. But the first night, the air conditioning blotted out all the sound, or was just too loud. They didn't realize they were recording on a TAC 4-track or something like that, reel to reel, of course. So that didn't work. The second night, the tape recorder malfunctioned, and the third night, something else happened. But the fourth night was when just about everything that you heard on the album in the years since was recorded. Then the album sat 4 years and didn't get out because of various things. For one thing, the record company collapsed at that point, I believe. Townes was in the middle of moving up here to Nashville, and various and sundry things went on that caused the delay. It sort of came out, I guess, in 77 or 8. It's been there ever since. It came at a time in his career where probably 95% of the songs people remember him for were already written and recorded and were on the album. It's got some of his really awful jokes and stage patter, which were pretty entertaining in and of themselves. And it's got, probably 40 songs. It wound up being a double album, and then it's been released and reissued and repressed, and I think Fat Possum wound up may be the label of record. But that's 40 years for an album to be continuously in print, particularly for artists who never had any particular huge sellings. Biggest success, of course, was as a songwriter for the Poncho and Lefty and some other tracks, but as an artist, he never sold particularly well. However, I have to say, at this point, he's probably got close to 30 albums out there due to various live reissues, repackages, stuff that was found after he died, and the Carnegie Hall concert. And there are 4 books about him and a movie. It's pretty amazing for someone who was not that successful in life to have then gone on to sort of have their legend grow and grow and grow. It's not unprecedented, but it is pretty unusual. In Townes' case, his legend has just grown.
And it's hard to say what it was with Townes. It feels a little bit more organic in some ways. Younger songwriters gravitated to Townes and amplified that legend on their own a little bit.
There's one really good live DVD, just live in Amsterdam, that is pretty much the equivalent on film of Live at the Old Quarter, in that it is a long video with 30 or 40 songs and some interview chat in the middle of it. Of course, the requisite bad jokes. You really have to see Townes say his jokes to fully appreciate him. He just had such a good delivery of them. He could be so deadpan. I mean, he sucked me in so bad early on when he looked at me one day and he said, John, I invented singing with your eyes closed. And the next day I happened to see Billy Gibbons, and I breathlessly informed him of this. And he looked at me like I told him he had a fish growing out of his ear or something. But Townes was great at that. So there you have him, a legend bigger. A lot of it, too, came from when he first started to tour Europe late in his career. They put out a bunch of live records through Harold Eggers, who was his road manager, and they'd made a deal where Harold could put out these albums. So he put out, 6 or 8 different live albums, and I think probably now of Townes' total output of recordings, there's probably at least half are live albums. Live at the Old Quarter still stands alone, though, to me, as the standard bearer, not just for Townes, but for a lot of artists, for a document. If you want to know why this guy is revered, here it is in one album. Bam, listen to this and you'll understand.
And then you're kind of bringing Steve Earle up to the point of Guitar Town a little bit, right?
Yeah, I was actually managing him right before it released and got him his first 2 record deals and a publishing deal. When I met him in January of 1975, he was, I guess, something like 18 then or 19, and he swore he'd have a record deal by the time he was 21, and that didn't happen. Eventually, in 86, he got off to a start that that he deserved years before with Guitar Town, but he had that talent all along. He didn't really fit Nashville. None of these people really fit Nashville. Nashville was hillbilly singers. Then his drug problems started really coming on strong after that. And the album was such a critical success. But he's still at it, You've got to give him credit. He's an enduring artist, and I felt like he would be, and he has been.
Now, Eddie, you had said that you didn't cross paths with Townes much at either the Armadillo or Threadgills. Did Guy Clark come into either of those worlds much?
He and Wilson were so close. Miner lived with those guys in Houston at one point. Miner ended up back here after San Francisco. They met here periodically, but it was never so much about being at the Armadillo as it was being in somebody's house. Well, I was at the Armadillo wishing I could get them booked. They were playing for free on somebody's sofa.
And this is Miner Wilson, the son of the photographer Burton Wilson?
Yeah, my age exactly. He was born on Halloween, on November 15th. He credited me with having raised his father. Burton spent a whole lot of time at the Armadillo. God bless him, I miss him. He and Bill Nair are most missed pals.
John, how did Travis Rivers come into your world?
I don't know when he and Mother Earth arrived here. My recollection of meeting up with him was within the first year that I was here. I ran into him somewhere, probably in the Exit Inn. That would have been that was pretty much the only hangout back then for people who weren't the downtown Printer's Alley crowd, and the young ones like us would go to the Exit Inn, and they had a bar area which was the hang. So I ran into him, and then later he began managing the Contenders, which was Champ Hood and Walter Hyatt and Steve Runkle and Jimbo Walsh, I believe. I remember going to a place called Mississippi Whiskers in Nashville, where he had arranged, or he had been requested to arrange, a showcase for labels to come see him. That was the only time. The other thing I remember was going to see him in his apartment, and it was wall-to-wall books. And he's not really a journalist, but he's got more books than I do. And he seemed to have read a fair number of them, too. I always liked him because he had a good gift of gab and had gotten around, and of course had the famous Janis Joplin quote about him as his calling card.
He had a rare bookstore in Austin when he was incredibly young. I can't remember the name of it right now, but he had a stockpile of books that he tried to peddle for a while, and then just, I think, retreated back to the house with them.
Well, he was pretty awe-inspiring, He had a good build on him, and you wouldn't want to mess with him, to say, other than he could outthink you, out-talk you, and he was certainly hairier than you.
I knew him before all these explorations, mainly as an Austin-San Francisco connecting figure, but then this other element of sort of the Nashville country rock, the Tracy Nelson and Mother Earth are kind of, understudied moment in that wave.
Yeah, a lot of people really don't give them proper credit. It's sort of like Steve Young doesn't get much credit for starting country rock when he did it long before the Graham and the Eagles and all those people did. Real interesting link between old country, modern, so back then country, and rock, and the San Francisco element.
Toad and Travis and Tracy, along with Powell, just a little nuclear powerhouse.
What are the things that you are either excited about or concerned about in music today?
Well, I have to say I've just kind of lost a lot of interest in it, partly because if you look at the song credits now for country songs, there will be 3, 4, and sometimes 5 writers. Where's the vision? I can understand a co-writing situation. What's that third writer doing? Is he bringing vowels, or is he a consonant man? or what? I mean, then the more writers you have, the more the vision is diluted. And now it's just all about the track. These writers put these words together, and it all's supposed to be up-tempo and positive. And they're really just creating these tracks which sound fabulous. But if you go and penetrate through the lyrics to these songs, they're skin deep. The writers, to me, are writing straight from the wallet, and they've lost the heart altogether. Country is sort of amalgam of part country, part rap, part rock. And then they throw a little banjo in at the bottom, and steel guitars and fiddles have just sort of been forgotten altogether. So country isn't really country anymore. But of course, America's moved from the country to the city. And so you have those influences there. So I've just kind of lost my excitement over it. Just very sad to see what became of country during the 47 years that I've been living here.
It makes me think that maybe that was, the century-long Lomax project was documenting that transition in American history across the generations.
It could be. I don't know. I've written the last 20 years. Most of what I've written has been published overseas rather than here. Actually, I had columns about what's happening in Nashville that started in 1980 and went to 2017 almost monthly for, I would say, at least a dozen different magazines that I'm trying to actually pull together and see if there's maybe a book in there.
Every time I teach about John and Alan Lomax, John Avery and Alan, I leave a cigar on John Avery Lomax's grave. I live a few blocks south of Oakwood Cemetery.
I went over there the last time I was in Austin for a Folklore a year and a half ago. I went over to the cemetery, showing some age there.
But yeah, I guess if you need someone on the ground in terms of cleaning or checking in with Oakwood, I'm really close by, and appreciated the arc of material that we've been able to cover today, and to thank you again for taking the time to be with us, John. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for including me. It's great always to see Eddie and listen to stories from him, and thank you, Jason, for putting together a good program. I enjoyed it.
We've learned that the more we do something, the better we do it. So let's just party on.
Yeah, sounds good.
All right.
All right. See y'all.
Bye-bye. Austin Roots, executive produced by TSSI, produced by Renee O'Connor. Crybaby, courtesy of Jake Andrews Music. You need to get the memoir so you can get ready for the pop quiz. Go to threadgills.com and get Armadillo World Headquarters a memoir. Do it now and do it right.